Alright, before we close tonight's show, I wanted to leave you with one final reflection. Because today's episode connected many different ideas together in a very interesting way. We've talked about shared culture, the analog world, the speed of technological change, millennials growing up between two completely different realities, and finally, now addressing the problem of procrastination. And at first glance, those topics may seem unrelated, but psychologically, I actually think they are deeply connected. Because one thing modern life increasingly creates is mental fragmentation. We have too many options, too many information, too much information, too much comparison, too much stimulation. And eventually, many people stop feeling psychologically grounded. They know many things, but internally, people feel scattered, overwhelmed, or frozen. And I think procrastination today is often less about lack of ambition and more about cognitive overload. People are absorbing constant news, constant bad news, constant notifications, constant comparison, constant pressure to optimize life, quote unquote. And eventually the nervous system begins saying, hey, I can't process anymore. Stop with the info, with the data delivery. So instead of moving, people emotionally freeze. And one thing I find very interesting comparing modern life with the 80s and 90s, and helpful to do so, that's why it's a whole segment, is that previous decades naturally forced more sequential living. I mean, you watched one TV program at a time. You listened to one album at a time. You rented one movie at a time, right? You talked to one person on the phone at a time. There were natural limits. And psychologically, limits sometimes protect the human nervous system. Now, modern life increasingly removes all limits. Everything competes for attention simultaneously. And many people silently live with the feeling of unfinished task or unfinished goals, unfinished conversations, unfinished ambitions for the future. Almost like having hundreds of open browser tabs inside the mind permanently. And I think that creates a very subtle form of emotional exhaustion that many people don't even fully recognize anymore. Because when the brain feels overwhelmed, it often escapes into avoidance, into scrolling, into comfort stimulation, or postponement. And this is why tonight's Pink Floyd song was so powerful emotionally, and it helps as a reminder. We're talking about Time by Pink Floyd. Because eventually people suddenly realize years have passed, and I think many adults quietly carry that fear. Not necessarily fear of aging itself, but fear of not fully living, not fully trying, or remaining psychologically stuck for too long. But this is also why I liked ending with the song Starting Over by John Lennon. Because psychologically, human beings need permission to restart. Not to restart perfectly, or as I was saying as a joke, restart dramatically like Rocky Balboa, Adrian. Not after becoming some ideal version of themselves first. Just starting again with 5 minutes task. And modern culture increasingly makes people feel that if they fail once, if they fall behind, or they lose momentum, then somehow the story is over. But real life rarely works that way. Most meaningful lives involved multiple restarts. We can see it over and over with the discography of many bands and artists. They, many times they weren't only artistic reinventions, but or professional reinventions. They were starting over as a person, like we saw the other time, the other case with Robert Plant or Eric Clapton tragedies in their families. So different careers, starting different identities, different relationships, different emotional chapters of our lives. And one thing older generations sometimes understood better is that life is long. Modern internet culture often makes everything feel urgent, immediate, right? And catastrophically late. But many people reinvent themselves at 40, at 50, at 60, or even later. And that's something worth remembering. Because one of the saddest things psychologically is not failing, it's abandoning movement completely. And maybe that's one reason this conversation about the 80s and 90s emotionally resonate with people now. Because despite all the problems those decades also had, there was often still a stronger feeling that life unfolded gradually. People were allowed to grow slowly, to discover themselves slowly, and evolve without constant public comparison. I think modern people increasingly need to consciously recover some of that slower rhythm again. Not by rejecting technology completely, but by protecting attention, protecting focus and presence, and protecting psychological continuity. Because human beings were never designed to emotionally process the entire world simultaneously every second. So maybe tonight's final reminder is very simple. If you've been procrastinating lately, don't interpret it immediately as failure, weakness, or laziness. Sometimes it may simply mean your mind is overloaded, your nervous system is overwhelmed, or your goals became psychologically too heavy. And sometimes healing momentum begins not with massive transformation, but with one small action. One email, one paragraph, one walk, one conversation, one small beginning. And many beautiful things in life quietly begin exactly that way. Alright everyone, that's been tonight's editorial here on Back to the Present. And so remember, please subscribe, participate in the community tab, subscribe to a Substack newsletter. Have a good day, have a good night, and remember to do what you can with what you have. Until the next one.